Hello there, I'm Jack, and I welcome you to Phantom Chamber, a safe space of dread and distress. Feel free to stick around. When it comes to the blues, you've got to have it to play it. Robert Johnson had the blues, and then some. His story is one of heartache and despair. It's a story of a country disillusioned by its own past and the presentiment of future predicaments. It's the grave founding of the unfortunate 27 Club and the turbulent tribulations of talent and its attainment. But it is also a story that lays the cornerstone to rock and roll and music as we now know it, perhaps most notably of all. It's a story shrouded in murk and mystery. Ultimately, it is not too grandiose to say that it's a story that embodies precisely why we listen to music. Aside from the melodies, it is as much to do with the lives that make them. In fact, with a legend as enduring and darkly endearing as Robert Johnson's. To say these tales and the qualities they imbue upon the music are why we listen is hardly grandiose enough. As the legend goes, it was an evening that held a metaphysical air. Quite how something so nebulous can be remembered up to this day is open to conjecture. But then there's much about the Delta blues and the mystic American South that holds out a stern but fair finger and asks how you'd know otherwise. The tale persists that the blue chords of day were bleached in the dark iridescence of the Mississippi nightfall, and the stars were flung out like crumbs from a picnic blanket onto the purple, black cloth of dusk. The moon rose over the bayou, setting beasts and blues, players howling alike, and the crooked hands of tupelo trees clawed at the illuminated clay ball, trying to drag it back down to swampy depths. Through the mist drove Robert Johnson, bidding a solemn farewell to town and civility, with a $10 guitar strapped to his back, looking for a tune. Not quite the downcast pariah he had been seen as. He was now a man on a mission. The despair of his past lay behind him, and his future stretched out on the warped paths ahead. At the crossroads where four dusty black roads met, Robert dropped to his knees, summoning the might to meet with his maker. He stretched out his guitar, and up rose Lucifer with a bargain in tow. He returned to the bluesy booze joints a year later, like a champion prodigal son, a songsmith virtuoso, the crowned king of Delta blues and the forefather of rock and roll, till the devil took back what was rightfully his. It is a legend of modern mythology, with roots that delve back all the way to the origins of the Deep South, but in life as mystified and devoid of tangible truths as Robert Johnson's, it's hard to discard the fiction for fear that it is actually a fact. Aside from the 29 compositions and 2 photographs that exist of the man we now know as the definitive luminary of modern music, any attempt to track down the facts immediately gets off to a rocky start. It is known he was born Robert Leroy Johnson in Hazlehurst, Mississippi, but the date of May 1911 is merely a best guess. The fact that he was never issued a birth certificate is as symptomatic of a man who seemed to emerge into existence from the darkness as it is of the troubled times. His life was marred by hardships and discrimination from an early age. His relatively wealthy stepfather, Charles Dodds, was forced to flee the Delta following threats of a lynching by jealous landowners. Thus, Johnson's early days wove a serpentine path through the South, and it's a path that would never be set straight until he arrived at the fateful crossroads. Even then, there's an argument it was as luring as ever, as any roads bar the famed highway of death and glory were seemingly barricaded by destiny. Following that best guess of birth came a boyhood equally as tricky to trace. It is believed that he was educated in Memphis, where he unearthed his passion for music. The scattered hoppings of census records, however, suggest he never settled for long. His mother remarried, and Robert spent the remaining days of his youth on a plantation. The emboldened young vagabond rejected the farming fate that lay ahead of him and chose to sing the field song rather than toil it. It was a choice that resulted in his sharecropper stepfather's beatings, planting the first seeds of Robert's unwavering resolve. Blues may have been born from the fields, but it did not flourish from that grounded oppression alone. Likewise, in Johnson's life, the blues would not take root fully until he was 18 years old. Although he had largely shunned a life on the land in favor of a musical path, he never really displayed the practice of a prodigy to any degree. As a teen, he would shuffle around the weekend shows, hoping to come across anyone with enough money to spare some. But by no means did his far from prodigious playing prize him a roost. Thus, when he met his sweetheart, Virginia Travis, a girl of fervently religious upbringing, he was ready to hang up the guitar and turn his back on the devil's music at the behest of her family. They married, and when Johnson was 18, his pregnant wife, with 2 weeks left of her term, traveled to her grandmother's, where she was to give birth. With his beat-up guitar tucked under his arm, Johnson took leave of the farm and set about using the fortnight as a final swan song of busked shows, before finally decamping from musical frolics in favor of wholesome family life. When he arrived to greet his wife and child, he was met with tragedy. Neither had survived the birth. It is a catastrophe where any words I could write would undoubtedly fall short of capturing the immensity of the moment and the boundlessness of his grief. Condolences likewise fall short, but they are the only thing we have to offer in such circumstances. On the contrary, however, Johnson did not receive comforting words, but rather further damnation. Virginia's religious relatives blamed the deaths on Johnson, saying his accursed affliction for the devil's music had brought about the tragedy. Though the Bible's singing appraisal of music would make this so-called religious viewpoint tantamount to heresy, it was no doubt in keeping with the theologians' talk of the time, and once again, it was a rhetoric of the day that seems to place Johnson's life at the spearhead of untimely fate. In his 18th year, the Great Depression had taken hold, and it was this economic factor, much more so than the word of any religious text, that pervaded the perdition of the blues. After all, the preacher's collection box was competing for the same kindness of strangers as the busking bluesman's open guitar case or upturned flat cap. Moreover, this factor led Johnson's life towards the circumstances that allowed the soul-selling legend to take hold, seeding the predestined future that would flower from the internal marriage of despair and desire. After the scornful condemnation of Virginia's family, following her death, Johnson decided to vindicate their remarks, embrace his soul's calling, and pursue a life of the blues. He yearned to follow that cataclysm with conquest and become a star. Only his playing remained woefully short of that which would result in stardom. Sadly, even the pockets of city folk had dried up. His street corner shows drew fewer handouts, and his livelihood was in jeopardy, but never the lifeblood of his blues. His time as a second-rate city musician was becoming untenable. Famed Delta players of the day, like Son House, recall having to chase Johnson off their instruments for fear he would snap a string, but he was always a ubiquitous presence in the juke joints that they would play. That is, until the day that he suddenly went away. The truth behind the year of no return is that he went back home to Hazelhurst, where he hooked up with local guitar hero, Ike Zimmerman. Ike taught Robert the only way to learn the blues, which may not include devilry, but it's certainly mystical in its own right. He took Robert out to the graveyard. Every midnight, when nobody would complain and spirits aided the strumming. Under the stewardship of Ike, Johnson's playing eventually blossomed, and his desire to conquer the guitar was finally met at painstaking but glorious ends. Thusly, the truth of the tale regarding his unearthly transformation is merely practice and discovering that the devil of the blues is in the detail of the playing, whilst the legend may be just that, a legend. It is clear that it would not have taken root from a life where honest toil and justly paid dues brought a harvest of munificent concessions that Johnson could enjoy in the peaceful pastures of a rightful home. Instead, at every metaphorical crooked crossroads or doomed diegesis, he was met with further castigation and hexed by misfortune, making the legend a fiction befitting of the fact. The brilliance of his blues never afforded him a bounty of spiritual catharsis to bask under the azure blue of the Mississippi sky or bathe in the boon of the southern Delta sun. To kick off his well-trodden boots, put his feet up and marvel at the kinship and the Bluebeard's strangled cries of song upon the old guitar player's porch, so to speak. He was a chaste and tortured soul from the get-go, so much so that an assembly with the Antichrist, fictional or otherwise, would barely made him flinch. However, any ardent mystic, reluctant to dismiss the Lucifer liaison, would do well to note that on the paths, from Robinsonville to Hazelhurst, there's any number of points where four roads meet. Legend aside, a year on, from the day his of departure, he returned to Robinsonville, having acquired the skills that would crown him king, where, once Son House had chased him from his stage, he now saw Johnson approach with a mean strut and a strange additional seventh string added to his dog-eared guitar. This time Johnson took to the spotlight and played as nobody had played before. Gone was the out-of-tune, scratching and doggerel hollering, and its place was a transcendent performer singing songs of hoodoo verse, laying down all that would be good in popular music to come, and in an instant securing his place as the king of the Delta blues. As is to be expected in the life of someone like Johnson, such success did little to diminish the heap of his burden. Another child and lover were kept from him owing to his profession of playing the music of the beast. His son, Claude Johnson, recalls that on one of only 2 times he ever saw his father, Robert handed over cash for his upbringing and asked to see the boy, only to be shepherded away from the premises. Whether or not it was with his soul, Johnson nevertheless paid a hefty price for his music. His fame grew, his songs got recorded, but his woes remained the same. The price of his life would finally be paid at a place aptly named the Three Forks. A friend and fellow blues player, Honey Boy recalled Robert as being fond of only 2 things: whiskey and women. Those are the 2 W's that in the blues world that lead to definite discontent. Both would have an equal hand in his demise. His life of mystery would stay true to the last. Whatever mythological figures of fate had choreographed his life like a mad dance of a cursed marionette were about to cut the threads loose. Johnson's whiskey was about to run out. He'd been flirting with the wrong girl and refused to heed warnings. He was handed a bottle of whiskey with a broken seal by an avenging husband. He died a few days later, poisoned. In the painful throes of his final hours, he crawled his way to the fresh air of night, tracking on all fours. At a roadside, he slumped down and slipped away. The stars, once more, scattered out across the firmament above him, like sequins of light, reflected in an unending puddle, twinkling over our hero like the glinting eye of heaven, the image of his lifeless body, drowned out in the pissing rain, would not be discovered till the early hours of the morning. Eventually, the devil always comes to collect.